Good morning. It's good to see everybody for yet again another episode of Fill My Cup. And I don't know about you, but I am so excited this morning just for the mere fact of being in the land of the living. That is certainly a blessing. I certainly hope you are all doing well, maintaining your sanity and staying protected. I'm glad that you took the time to study God's word with us on this morning. And this morning, I'd like to kind of talk about or speak from the thought, I'm looking for a miracle. I'm looking for a miracle. I have to admit, one of my absolute favorite gospel songs of all times is entitled Miracle by Maddie Moss Clark and the Clark sisters. I can remember hearing this song back when I was a child on a vinyl record. Some of you can actually remember records. They're probably hard to find now. And some of you probably have never seen a record or potentially never heard of it. But where's my witnesses to the vinyl records? I can remember being over my grandmother and grandfather's house and finding that record and playing it. And the words were this: I'm looking for a miracle. I expect the impossible. I feel the intangible, and I see the invisible. The sky is the limit to what I can have. Just believe it and receive it. God will perform it today. I love that song. I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite songs. If I had the time, I'd probably sing it to you. But I don't have the time this morning. But there just aren't words. Those just aren't words of a song to me. But I firmly believe that we serve a God that performs miracles. I hope I have a witness on a Sunday morning that knows without a shadow of a doubt, you believe that God performs miracles. But the reality is, far too often, when we think of miracles, some of us believe that this is some far off thing that was only given out by God in biblical narratives that we read. But saints of God, God is just not a miracle worker of the past, but God is still a miracle worker right here in 2021. Which is exactly why I don't want any one of you to ever give up on God, regardless of how impossible certain situations in your life appear to be. Because my encouragement to you this morning is miracles do still happen. Yes, life will throw some situations at you that appear to be hopeless. In fact, I would dare to say that all of us have been presented with problems in our lives that may have seemed insurmountable. In fact, I'm sure that there may have been some times in which you may be wondering, where is God? Because you need him to work a miracle in your life. Because all of us have or will find out that there will come a day in your life that something will happen that only God can get you out of. I'm going to say that again. All of us will find out that there will come a day in our lives that something is going to happen in which the only way we're going to get out of it is because of the hand of God. And I'm not talking about from what I've heard. I'm speaking from a personal experience. There have been things that have happened to me in my life that only the hand of God was able to correct, and only the hand of God was able to guide me and help me navigate through it. Is there anybody here on a Sunday morning that needs God to do something for them that is supernatural? This message is not for the weak-hearted, is not for the individuals that don't have a lot of faith, but I need some people that can stand with me this morning and stand in agreement that will say miracles still do happen. And I just firmly believe there's somebody right now that hears me and you are battling with something going on in your life. And this is going to be your encouragement. You hold on, keep on trusting God, and expect a miracle to happen in your life. If I'm talking to you on this morning, if you are that person that needs a gentle reminder that God is a miracle worker, then I think this text this morning is for you. I'm believing that I have a few people that need a miracle from God on the first Sunday in March. So turn with me, if you don't mind, to Psalm 77. We are going to look again at Psalm 77, and we are going to look at the first 14 verses. And I'm going to be coming from the NIV translation. Again, I'm looking for a miracle. Psalm 77, verse 1 through 14. What you will discover, saints of God, here in the 77th Psalm, this psalm is a testimony that is birthed out of pain. It is a psalm that never reveals what specifically is troubling the psalmist, but it shows how the psalmist responded to the painful circumstances that they found themselves in. It is a psalm that transitions from complaint to praise. So let's look at verse 1. Verse 1 says, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. Here in verse 1, we have the psalmist. This was a cry to God out of distress. Because when you find yourself in trouble, your cry should first be directed to God, because you cannot depend on the world to have the answers for your trouble. And here, this psalmist just doesn't stop with one cry, but the psalmist prayed again and again, because you see in verse 1, the A stanza, it says, I cried out to God for help. And then after saying that, he comes right back again and says, I cried out to God to hear me. So it was a consistent prayer over and over again. It was not a silent prayer, but it was a vocal prayer. Look at verse 2. It says, when I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. Look at this psalmist's posture of prayer. His hands were stretched out, and the psalmist prayed all night long. Look at verse 3. He says, I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. Verse 4, he says, you kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. Here we have the psalmist was experiencing so much trouble in his life that he could not even get any rest. And the psalmist suggests that the reason that he couldn't get any sleep is because God was keeping his eyes open. So here we have the psalmist in his mind. He is still up because God won't allow him to get any rest. He won't allow the trouble to go away, to disappear. He is praying to God, but the circumstances and the trouble is still there. So the psalmist is awake all night long. And as a result, he can't even talk rationally. His heart is troubled and he can't even sleep. And now he cannot even talk. Has anything ever got you so down in your life that you didn't even have the strength to even talk about it anymore? You didn't even have the ability to rationalize what was actually going on in your life. You could not think straight. Trouble has just turned your world upside down. That's how it is with this psalmist. Now in verse 4, he was at the point of just wanting to give up. The psalmist here is in a deep state of depression. And saints of God, there are a lot of us in this world right now that are in a state of depression. One of the things they most fear is coming out of this pandemic is how people aren't just going to be physically harmed, but now they are going to be harmed mentally, having to deal with the after effects of this pandemic. Saints of God, depression is real. Anxiety is real. That's where this psalmist is in verse 4. And look at verse 5. It says, I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. Here the psalmist starts telling God that at one point in my life, God, you used to be good to me. Now look at verse 6. He says, I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated and my spirit asked. Here it is. There used to be a point in this psalmist's life that he could just sing the pain away. But now this pain is different. A song isn't just going to make this trouble that he has, it's just not going to magically disappear. Is there anybody that can witness to a time that no matter what you try to do to make the trouble go away, nothing changed? Some of you may have tried a drink, may have tried other things to make the trouble go away, and you were just masking the trouble because the trouble was still there. Nothing had changed. Everything that the psalmist tries of himself does not work. In verse 5 and in verse 6, each of his solutions centered around I. Because look in verse 5, it says, I thought about the former days. Look in verse 6, it says, I remembered my songs in the night. Saints of God, there was no inclusion of God. There was no focus of the psalmist on God. The psalmist was not focusing on God, but the psalmist was focusing on his circumstances, which now has led the psalmist in verse 7 through 9, now questioning the character of God. So in verse 5 and 6, focusing on the circumstances, and the other verses focusing on the circumstances. Now here, verse 7 through 9, now the psalmist begins to question the character of God. Look what he says in verse 7. He says, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? So here we have the psalmist beginning the psalm praying to God again and again. He doesn't hear from God. So now he begins to ask questions of the character of God. And what's interesting is the psalmist begins to talk to himself and ask these questions of the character of God. And he just doesn't ask one question, but in verse 7 through 9, he asks 6 questions. The psalmist ultimately wants to know, has God changed? Has the God I served changed? Because he used to hear me, but now it doesn't appear like he's hearing me anymore. The psalmist wants to know, does God have the same character? Has God's ways changed? The psalmist starts wondering, will things ever get any better for him? Has that happened to any of you out there? The psalmist felt like maybe this season of trouble might last forever. The psalmist feared that maybe he would never again see the favor of God. Never again maybe would he see the mercy of God. And never again would he see the fulfillment of God's promises. But then, saints of God, in verse 10, there is a shift in the perspective of the psalmist. The psalmist in verse 10 has a reality check because his circumstances are still the same, but his perspectives have changed. And you're wondering, and some of you may be wondering why your circumstances have yet changed. Maybe the reason the circumstances have not changed is because God is waiting on your perspective to first change. Because in verse 10, the psalmist starts answering all the questions that he asked of himself. Look at verse 10. Verse 10 says, "Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand." Verse 11, "I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago." Verse 12, "I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds." Verse 10, "Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds." The change in perspective has now changed in verse 10 and 10 through 12 for the psalmist. The psalmist begins to have flashbacks. He begins to remember when God used his right hand, meaning God used his power to strengthen and protect him. The psalmist has now stopped having a pity party for himself. The psalmist begins to remember what God had already done for him in the past. And that, saints of God, is what I challenge all of us to do in our moments of trouble. Do not forget about the actions and the miracles that God has done for us in the past. The psalmist remembers that God is a God of miracles because God has done things for us that nobody else but him can do. You need to remember that God is a God of miracles. He has done things for you that nobody else can do. So not only should we remember the great works of God, but we should also meditate on those works. The psalmist says, "I will meditate on all your mighty works," which implies it was more than just one thing that God had done. And some of us forget about everything that God has done for us in our life. If I had time, I'd start talking to you about all the things that God has done for us, but I don't have enough time. It is a multiplicity of things that God has done for us. Too many things for us to count. And when you meditate on his works, saints of God, you will remember who God is and what God can still do. Because first, God is a God of miracles, but also when you meditate on his works, you will remember who God is and what God can still do. Because look at verse 13. Verse 13 says, "Your ways, God, are holy." What God is as great as our God. What God is as great as our God. Verse 14, You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. So we have the psalmist going from questioning the character of God. Then he begins to remember what God has done for him in the past, and he begins to meditate on that, and he starts thinking about who God actually really is and what God still has the power to do. So he goes from questioning the character of God to then remembering who God is and talking about what God still is to him. He says, your ways, God, they are holy. What God is as great as our God. So as I close, God is not just a God of miracles, but God does miracles. Don't miss that. God is not just a God of miracles, but saints, God does miracles, which means the same way that God performed miracles of the past is the same God that can perform miracles right now, because God is holy, God is great, God is powerful. Because here, beginning in verse 13 through verse 20, if you read the rest of the psalm, the psalmist makes 21 mentions of God and 0 personal references. He changes the I and starts focusing on God. The psalmist has a change in his perspective. And that's all I'm trying to tell you on this Sunday morning. Stop focusing on the problem and focus on God. I am looking for a miracle, because if your focus is not on God, then you will never be in the right position to receive a miracle. So live your life every day looking for a miracle. Saints of God, I am looking for a miracle. I expect the impossible. I feel the intangible. I see the invisible. The sky is the limit to what I can have. Just believe it and receive it, and God will perform it today. I'm done. Stay blessed. Stay safe. Stay prayerful. Stay looking for that miracle. I'm out. See you next time. Peace.